I am often asked, even now in my later years, whether there exists a single case which I would describe as the most baffling of all those I witnessed during my association with Sherlock Holmes. To this I have no immediate answer, for the truth is that every investigation carried its own peculiar darkness itself, an arrangement of impossibilities which, at first glance, appeared to defy reason itself. And yet, if pressed, I find my thoughts returning again and again to the affair of the locked room of Camden Passenger case, which began, as so many tragedies do, with a letter delivered in haste and fear upon a wet London morning. It was in the early hours of a dull November day that I found Holmes already seated by the fire at Baker Street, his dressing gown loosely wrapped about him, a half-consumed cigarette between his fingers, and a pile of unopened correspondence scattered across the table like the debris of some neglected war. The fog outside pressed against the windows in thick yellow coils, and the gas lamps along Baker Street burned with a sickly, struggling glow. Holmes, however, appeared entirely indifferent to the gloom of the world. His attention was fixed upon a small pocket-watch which lay open upon his palm. "Watson," he said, without looking up. "Yes? Tell me, what do you infer from a watch that loses precisely 2 minutes every day, yet shows no mechanical fault?" I removed my coat slowly, accustomed as I was to such abrupt interrogations. "That it is influenced by an external factor," I replied. "Good," he murmured. "And what sort of factor?" "Temperature? Magnetic interference." Holmes finally looked up, his eyes bright with amusement. "Precisely. And yet the owner insists it is merely tired." He closed the watch with a snap. "Men, Watson, are forever attributing moral conditions to mechanical failures." Before I could respond, the sharp ring of the bell interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps followed almost immediately, and then she entered, holding a damp envelope between her fingers, as though it might stain her. "For you, Mr. Holmes," she said nervously. Holmes took it without ceremony. The envelope bore no seal, no crest, only a hurried hand that trembled even in its writing. He tore it open. As he read, the faint amusement vanished from his face. That alone was enough to alert me, for Sherlock Holmes did not often abandon amusement unless something of genuine consequence had occurred. He read the letter twice. Then he rose. "We shall leave within the hour," he said. I glanced at him. "Where to?" "Camden Passage," he replied. "And the matter?" "A locked room," he said simply, "in which a man is already dead, though no one can enter it." We arrived at Camden Passage shortly before noon. The rain had worsened, and the narrow streets glistened like black glass beneath the carriage wheels. A small crowd had gathered outside a narrow 4-story lodging-house wedged between a tailor shop and a shuttered bookseller. The building itself appeared unremarkable, one of those anonymous London dwellings in which hundreds of lives begin and end without record. Yet there was an unease in the air that could not be ignored. A constable stepped forward as we descended. "Dr. Watson," he said with a nod of recognition, then turned toward Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, we were told to expect you." Holmes inclined his head. "Who instructed you to send for me?" "The landlord, sir, and Inspector Marlowe of Scotland Yard." At the mention of Marlowe, Holmes's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "A man of great enthusiasm and limited imagination," he murmured to me. We were led inside. The interior of the building smelled faintly of damp wood, boiled cabbage, and something sharp of fear, perhaps, or the residue of it. On the third-floor landing stood Inspector Marlowe himself, a solid, red-faced man whose confidence in his own methods was only matched by his impatience with those of others. "Holmes," he said briskly, "I'll warn you now this one's clean shut." "So I understand," Holmes replied. Marlowe gestured toward a door at the end of the corridor. The room belonged to a clerk named Henry Ellison. Quiet fellow. No enemies. No debts worth mentioning. Yesterday evening he locked himself in. This morning when the landlord came to collect rent he didn't answer. The door is still locked from the inside. Holmes studied the door. It was a plain wooden structure, old but solid, with a brass handle and a keyhole showing no signs of tampering. "And the windows?" Holmes asked. "Also locked," said Marlowe. "And barred. We've checked." "Have you broken the door?" "We attempted. No success. The lock holds firm." Holmes nodded slowly. "And the body?" Marlowe hesitated. "That is the curious part. We can see him through the keyhole." I felt a slight chill. "Through the keyhole?" I repeated. "Yes," said Marlowe. "He is lying on the floor, quite clearly dead." But the room remained sealed. Holmes stepped closer to the door. He knelt and looked through the keyhole. For a long moment he remained there, motionless. Then he rose. "Well?" I asked. Holmes brushed dust from his sleeve. "He is indeed dead," he said calmly. Marlowe folded his arms. "I told you so." "But," Holmes added, "not in the manner you assume." The inspector frowned. "And what manner do I assume?" Holmes smiled faintly. "That he died inside the room." A silence followed. Marlowe looked irritated. "And what are you suggesting?" Holmes turned his head slightly. "I am suggesting," he said quietly, "that the room is not as locked as it believes itself to be." I exchanged a glance with Marlowe. The inspector gave a short laugh. "That door hasn't opened since last night." Holmes straightened. "Then we shall open it now." Marlowe stiffened. "It won't open." Holmes extended his hand. "A hairpin, Watson." I handed him one without question. He examined the lock for only a moment, then inserted the pin with delicate precision. "What are you doing?" Marlowe demanded. "Proving a point," Holmes replied. A click followed almost immediately. The inspector stepped back. "That's impossible." Holmes turned the handle. The door opened, and at that moment the atmosphere in the corridor changed entirely. Because the impossible had ceased to be theoretical. It had become physical. Inside the room the air was still. A man lay collapsed near the bed, face turned slightly toward us, eyes open, unmoving. Inspector Marlowe stepped forward quickly. I don't understand how, but Holmes did not enter immediately. Instead he stood at the threshold, studying, observing, calculating. Then he spoke softly. "This is not a locked-room mystery, Inspector." Marlowe frowned. "What is it then?" Holmes looked at the body. "It is a lesson." "A lesson in what?" Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "In how carefully a lie can be arranged when one understands how people are trained to look at doors." And with that he stepped inside. I followed him, though I had no idea at the time that this room, this apparently simple sealed chamber, would become the first thread in a case that would eventually lead us into a darkness far deeper than murder. For as Holmes bent over the body of Henry Ellison, I saw something on the floor beside him, something that should not have been there. A small fragment of glass, shaped not by accident, but by design. And Holmes, seeing it too, spoke a single sentence which I have never forgotten. "Watson, this man did not die alone." And in that moment I understood. This was not a locked room at all. It was a beginning. The moment Holmes spoke those words, "This man did not die alone," the atmosphere within the sealed chamber altered in a manner I can only describe as perceptible. It was not that anything changed in a physical sense. The corpse of Henry Ellison remained where it lay. The dim light from the corridor still filtered through the open doorway, and Inspector Marlowe still stood behind us with that expression of growing irritation which was so characteristic of him when confronted with phenomena he could not immediately classify. And yet, for Holmes and myself at least, the room had become something entirely different. It had become a narrative, and narratives, as Holmes once remarked to me, are often more revealing than facts. Inspector Marlowe cleared his throat loudly. "I should remind you, Holmes, that the door was locked from the inside. There is no dispute about that." Holmes did not look up from the floor. "There rarely is, Inspector. That is not helpful." "No," Holmes agreed calmly, "but it is accurate." I knelt beside him. The body of Henry Ellison was that of an ordinary clerk in his late 30s. His clothing was neat, his posture oddly composed, as though death had arrived without struggle and been accepted without protest. There were no visible wounds, no sign of blood, no obvious injury of any kind. "Cause of death?" I asked quietly. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and produced a small magnifying glass, which he used to examine Ellison's face with deliberate patience. "Observe, Watson," he said at length. "Yes?" "The eyes are not fully relaxed." I leaned closer. It was subtle, but once pointed out, unmistakable. The eyelids were not entirely closed, nor were they wide open in the manner of sudden shock. They rested in a state of unnatural partial tension. "What does that suggest?" I asked. "Interruption," Holmes replied. Marlowe snorted from behind us. "Death is always an interruption." Holmes smiled faintly. "True, but not always a sudden one." He rose slowly and turned his attention to the room itself. The chamber was modest. A bed, a writing table, a chair overturned slightly to one side, and a single oil lamp which had burned down to a dull, congealed residue. The air carried a faint, almost imperceptible scent. Holmes inhaled once. "Watson," he said, "do you smell that?" I concentrated. At first I detected nothing unusual. Then, faintly, "A chemical odor?" I suggested. Indeed, Holmes crossed to the desk. A single sheet of paper lay upon it, partially crumpled, as though it had been read in haste or agitation. He picked it up carefully. "Any signs of forced entry?" I asked. "None," Marlowe replied quickly. "The window is locked. The door was locked. No disturbance." Holmes did not respond to the inspector. He was reading. Then he frowned. That, too, was notable. Holmes does not often frown at simple correspondence. "What is it?" I asked. He handed me the paper. The handwriting was uneven, hurried, and faintly smudged. The contents were brief. "If you are reading this, then I have already been mistaken in trusting the arrangement. Do not open the cupboard. Do not trust the clock. The face is not where it should be." I looked up. "This makes no sense." Holmes nodded. "On the contrary, Watson, it makes perfect sense to the writer." Marlowe stepped forward. "Cryptic nonsense. Likely the ramblings of a disturbed man." Holmes returned the paper to the desk. "Possibly." Holmes turned slightly. "Or possibly the final communication of a man who understood he had placed himself inside a controlled experiment." That remark produced silence. Even Marlowe seemed momentarily uncertain how to respond. Holmes walked slowly toward the corner of the room. There stood a small wooden cupboard. Simple, unremarkable. "Do not open the cupboard," I murmured, recalling the letter. Holmes smiled faintly. "Instructions are rarely absolute, Watson. They are invitations to think." He placed his hand upon the handle. Marlowe stepped forward sharply. "I must insist you do not tamper with." Holmes opened it. Inside were neatly arranged personal effects, clothing, papers, a small collection of books. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Yet Holmes did not move away. Instead, he leaned closer. Then he reached in and removed something from the back of the cupboard. A small brass object, a pocket watch. He held it up. The inspector frowned. "A watch? That's your great discovery?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He opened it. The face was cracked, but the hands were frozen. At exactly 3:17. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Watson," he said quietly, "what did I ask you this morning about a watch that loses 2 minutes a day?" I recalled the question instantly. That external influence might be responsible. He closed the watch. "This one does not lose time," he said. "It stops it." A silence followed. Then Marlowe scoffed. "That is meaningless." Holmes turned to him. "Is it?" He held up the watch. "This man died at precisely the same time every day." Marlowe frowned deeply. "That's absurd." Holmes stepped toward the body. "Not every day, Inspector." A pause. "Only once." The inspector looked increasingly frustrated. "I don't follow." Holmes gestured toward the room. "Consider the arrangement." He began to pace slowly. The door locked from the inside, the window secured. No sign of entry. He stopped. "And yet the man is dead." "Yes," Marlowe said sharply. "We established that." Holmes nodded. "But what if the room itself was the mechanism?" That sentence altered the atmosphere again. Even I felt a slight unease. "The room?" I repeated. Holmes nodded. "Not the killer entering the room." A pause. "But the room entering the killer." Marlowe stared at him. "That is nonsense." Holmes smiled slightly. "Is it?" He pointed toward the clock on the wall. "Watson, what time is it?" I checked my watch. Just past noon. Holmes turned back to the inspector. "And yet this man died at 3:17. Marlowe shook his head. "You are suggesting he died hours before the discovery." Holmes nodded. "And locked the room afterward?" Holmes's eyes brightened slightly. "Now you are beginning to understand the correct question." A silence followed. Then Holmes moved to the window. He examined the frame carefully. The lock, the seal, the dust along the sill. Then he smiled. I stepped forward. "What is it?" Holmes pointed. "Fingerprints." Marlowe leaned in. "Everyone has fingerprints." "Yes," Holmes said softly, "but not everyone leaves them in the same direction." He indicated faint marks upon the interior latch. "These indicate closure from outside the room." Marlowe frowned. "That contradicts everything we know." Holmes nodded. "Exactly." He turned slowly. "Which is why the correct conclusion is not that the room was locked." A pause. "But that it was staged to appear locked." The inspector looked at him for a long moment. "And who would do such a thing?" Holmes's gaze returned to the body. "Someone who understands human assumptions." He stepped closer to the corpse. "And who understands that most people believe what they see through keyholes more readily than what they observe in open rooms." A silence followed. Then Holmes added quietly, "And someone who did not want us to look beyond the first body." I felt a chill at those words. "First body?" I repeated. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the man's coat pocket and withdrew a second object, a photograph. He looked at it for a long moment, then handed it to me. I froze, because the face in the photograph was not Henry Ellison. It was someone else entirely, someone I had never seen. Yet Holmes had, and his expression told me everything I needed to know. This case had already begun long before we entered Camden Passage, and Henry Ellison was not the beginning. He was a message. The photograph remained in my hand longer than I care to admit. It is a curious thing how a simple piece of paper, no larger than a playing card, can alter the atmosphere of an entire investigation. Yet as I studied it under the dim corridor light of Camden Passage, I felt distinctly as though I were no longer looking at a clue, but at the edge of something far larger, something which had been carefully folded away from public view. The face upon it was that of a man in his middle years, well-dressed, composed with the faint severity of expression often found in those accustomed to authority. There was nothing remarkable about him at first glance, and yet I was certain I had never seen him before in my life. And Holmes had. That much was evident from the moment I glanced toward him. He stood perfectly still beside the body of Henry Ellison, his gaze fixed not upon the corpse, nor upon the room, but upon the photograph itself in my hand. Inspector Marlowe broke the silence first. "Well, what is it? Some acquaintance of yours, Holmes?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward and gently took the photograph from me. He studied it for several seconds. Then he said very quietly, "This man should not exist." Marlowe gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "I beg your pardon?" Holmes turned the photograph slightly toward the light. "Not here," he said. "Not in this context. Not connected to Henry Ellison." He paused. "And certainly not inside Camden Passage." I frowned. "You recognize him?" Holmes nodded once. "I do." "And?" His eyes narrowed. "And that is precisely the problem." Marlowe folded his arms impatiently. "Holmes, either explain yourself or stop speaking in riddles." Holmes ignored him, a habit I had learned long ago not to interpret as discourtesy but as concentration. He returned the photograph to me. "Watson, observe carefully." I did so. "Do you notice anything missing?" I examined it again. No identifying marks, no background of significance. "It appears to be taken in a studio." "Precisely," Holmes said. "And yet," he added, "this man never sat for such a portrait." That statement immediately drew my attention. "How can you be certain?" Holmes turned toward the body on the floor. "Because I have met him." A silence followed. Marlowe narrowed his eyes. "You are saying the dead man knew him?" Holmes shook his head. "No." "Then what are you saying?" Holmes walked slowly toward the cupboard. "I am saying the photograph predates the identity of the corpse." That sentence, though seemingly simple, carried implications I did not yet fully understand. He opened the cupboard again. This time he examined its interior with renewed intensity. Then he stopped. "Watson." "Yes?" "Look at the back panel." I approached and did so. At first I saw nothing unusual, but Holmes pointed to a faint irregularity in the wood grain. A seam. Almost invisible. "I do not like concealed seams," Holmes murmured. "Why not?" I asked. "Because they imply intention." He pressed gently. A faint click sounded. Marlowe immediately stepped forward. "What are you doing now?" Holmes opened the false panel. Behind it lay a shallow cavity, and inside, a second watch. "This is identical," I said. Holmes nodded. "To the first?" Marlowe frowned. "There are two watches?" Holmes removed it carefully. He opened it. The hands were frozen at the same time. March 17th. Marlowe shook his head. "This is absurd. Why would there be two identical watches hidden in a cupboard?" Holmes closed both watches in his hands. "Because one is not enough." "Not enough for what?" Holmes looked up slowly. "For time to be observed." That answer did not clarify anything. It only deepened the mystery. Holmes turned toward the body again. "Henry Ellison was not the owner of this room in any meaningful sense." Marlowe frowned. "He rented it." Holmes nodded. "But he did not control it." He walked toward the writing desk. "Observe, Inspector. The chair is positioned slightly away from the desk, not aligned with habitual use." Marlowe shrugged. "So?" Holmes gestured. "It indicates hesitation, or displacement." He opened the drawer. Inside were neatly arranged papers, but Holmes did not focus on those. Instead, he examined the underside of the drawer. Then he smiled faintly. I leaned closer. "What is it?" Holmes pointed to a small residue, a faint circular mark. "What do you see?" "A stain?" Holmes nodded. "From a glass," Marlowe scoffed. "This is ridiculous. Every desk has stains." Holmes turned sharply toward him. "Not from a glass that has been placed and removed at exactly the same position multiple times." A pause. He straightened. "This room has been staged." I felt a growing unease. Staged for what purpose? Holmes's voice lowered. "To make us believe Henry Ellison lived here alone." A silence followed. Then Holmes turned toward the door. "Watson, recall the letter." I did. "Do not trust the clock," Holmes continued. "And now we find 2 watches." He held them up. "Both frozen at the same time." He paused. "And a corpse that appears to have died in isolation." Marlowe crossed his arms. "That is exactly what happened." Holmes shook his head. "No." He stepped closer to the inspector. "That is what we were meant to believe happened." A silence followed. Then Holmes said something that altered the entire direction of the case. "Henry Ellison was not the primary subject of this room." Marlowe frowned. "Then who was?" Holmes looked at the cupboard. "The person who arranged it." A pause. "And the person who needed us to arrive." That statement produced a shift in the air I cannot properly describe. It was as though the room had suddenly acquired depth beyond its walls. Marlowe looked increasingly frustrated. "Holmes, you are suggesting a conspiracy." "I am suggesting," Holmes replied calmly, "a design." He turned to me. "Watson, what is the purpose of a locked room?" "To prevent entry." "And?" "To conceal cause of death." Holmes nodded. "And if neither of those applies?" I hesitated. "I do not understand." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then you are thinking like most people." He walked slowly toward the door. "A locked room is not always a prison." A pause. "Sometimes it is a frame." Marlowe stared at him. "A frame for what?" Holmes placed his hand on the door. "For a story." Then he opened it wider, and as he did so a constable rushed up the stairs. "Inspector!" Marlowe turned sharply. "What is it?" The constable looked pale. "There's been another incident." Holmes did not move. Marlowe frowned. "Another what?" The constable swallowed. "A second room, sir. In the same building." A silence followed. Then Holmes said quietly, "Of course there is." Marlowe turned to him. "What do you mean?" Holmes picked up his coat. "I mean, Inspector," he said calmly, "that we are no longer investigating a single death." He paused. "We are investigating a system." And with that he stepped into the corridor. I followed him immediately, because at that moment I realized something unsettling. Henry Ellison had not been the first victim, and unless Holmes was mistaken, which history had taught me was unlikely, he would not be the last. The second room lay on the uppermost floor of Camden Passage House, in a narrow corridor that smelled faintly of damp plaster and old coal dust. Even before we reached it, I could sense a change in the atmosphere of the building. It was not merely the agitation of the constable who had summoned us, nor the hurried footsteps of Inspector Marlowe ahead of us on the stairs. It was something subtler, a shift in the behavior of the house itself, as though it had grown aware that its first secret had been exposed and now prepared, reluctantly, to reveal another. Holmes ascended without haste. That in itself was telling. Most men would have hurried toward a second death. Holmes, however, treated repetition not as urgency, but as instruction. Inspector Marlowe glanced back at him. "If this is some kind of prank," he muttered, "I warn you Scotland Yard will not appreciate it." Holmes did not respond. Instead he asked quietly, "Is the door still sealed?" "Yes," the constable replied from ahead. "Exactly like the first, locked from the inside." Holmes nodded once. "Exactly like the first," he repeated, and something in his tone made the phrase sound less like confirmation and more like recognition. We reached the landing. 2 uniformed officers stood rigidly outside a closed door. One of them looked pale. The other avoided eye contact entirely. Marlowe stepped forward immediately. "Open it." The officer hesitated. It won't open, sir." Marlowe's jaw tightened. "Everything opens if one applies sufficient force." He motioned to the men. "Break it down." But Holmes raised a hand. "Wait." Marlowe turned sharply. "Holmes, I am not in the habit of delaying death investigations." Holmes stepped closer to the door. "I am not delaying it," he said quietly. "I am preventing you from destroying evidence before I have seen it." That alone was enough to halt Marlowe's command. The inspector exhaled sharply. "Very well." but make it quick." Holmes knelt before the lock. Once again he did not force it. He studied it, as though listening to it. Then he said softly, "This is not the same mechanism." Marlowe frowned. "It looks identical." Externally, Holmes agreed. He rose. "But not in function." He turned toward the offices. "Was anyone inside when it was found?" The constable shook his head. "No, sir, but we saw the body through the keyhole." Holmes nodded. "Of course you did." Marlowe crossed his arms. "You are enjoying this too much." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, Inspector, I am concerned." That statement made me glance at him. Holmes did not often admit concern. He placed his hand upon the door. "Stand back." Then, instead of using any instrument, he applied gentle pressure. The door opened. Marlowe stiffened. "That's impossible." Holmes stepped inside, and I followed immediately after him. The room was similar in structure to the first, though larger and more sparsely furnished. A bed stood against the far wall, a chair overturned beside it, and a writing desk positioned beneath a narrow window. But it was not the arrangement that caused me to pause. It was the body. A man lay upon the floor in a posture that suggested no struggle, no resistance. Upon the floor in a posture that suggested no struggle, no resistance, no awareness of danger. Inspector Marlowe entered behind us. "Second clerk," he said immediately. "Name, Robert Henslow. Works in shipping accounts downstairs." Holmes knelt beside the body, and for a long time said nothing. I noticed something immediately. There was no visible injury, no blood, no sign of violence. Yet something about the stillness of the man was profoundly wrong. It was not peaceful death. It was interrupted life. Holmes extended his hand and gently touched the man's wrist. Then he withdrew it. "Watson," he said quietly. "Yes? Do you notice the similarity? I looked between this room and the one below." "Yes," I said slowly. "It is almost identical." Holmes nodded. "And that is the problem." Marlowe frowned. "The problem?" Holmes rose. "This is not coincidence." He turned slowly in place. "This is replication." Marlowe gave a short laugh. "You are suggesting someone is copying murders?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the desk. As before, the chair was slightly misaligned, the inkstand undisturbed, the papers neatly placed, too neatly. Holmes opened the drawer. He frowned slightly. "That is new," he murmured. I stepped closer. "What is it?" "In the first room," Holmes said, "there was residue of use." He looked at the surface of the desk. "Here there is absence." Marlowe shrugged. "So what?" Holmes turned sharply. "So what?" His voice sharpened slightly. "It means this room was not used to contain a life." A pause. "It was used to simulate one." Silence followed. Even Marlowe seemed momentarily unsettled. Holmes turned toward the window. He examined it carefully. Then he pointed. "Watson, observe the latch." I did. "It is identical to the first room," I said. "No," Holmes replied. "Look closer." I did so. And then I saw it. A faint difference. The metal was newer, polished differently, replaced. Holmes nodded. "Exactly." Marlowe frowned. "What does that matter?" Holmes turned toward him. "It matters because the first room was staged to appear authentic." He paused. "This one was staged to correct an error." That statement hung in the air. I felt a growing unease I could not fully articulate. Holmes moved back toward the body. "This man died recently." Marlowe nodded. "The first died earlier." Holmes looked at him. "And yet both rooms were prepared simultaneously." A pause. "How do you explain that?" Marlowe hesitated. Holmes nodded. "Precisely." He stepped back. "This is not a sequence of events." He gestured between the two rooms. "It is a construction." I frowned. "A construction of what?" Holmes turned toward me. "A pattern." A silence followed. Then Holmes added quietly, "And patterns are rarely created for victims." He looked at the body again. "But for observers." That sentence unsettled me more than anything thus far. Marlowe, however, appeared increasingly frustrated. "So what are you saying, Holmes?" "That someone is building rooms for you to find." Holmes smiled faintly. The inspector stared at him. "That is absurd." Holmes shook his head. "No." He stepped closer. "It is deliberate." A pause. "And we are now inside it." For the first time I felt a distinct chill that had nothing to do with the weather or the building itself, because I suddenly understood something Holmes had not yet stated outright. We were not merely investigating deaths. We were being guided through them. Holmes turned toward the corridor. "Watson," he said quietly. "Yes?" "Do you know what is more dangerous than a locked room?" I hesitated. "No." He smiled faintly. "A room that teaches you how to open it." A silence followed. Then a constable rushed up the stairs once more. "Inspector," Marlowe snapped. "What now?" The man was breathless. "There's something else." Holmes closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "Yes," he said softly. "I expected that." Marlowe turned toward him. "You expected it?" Holmes picked up his coat again. "This is no longer a question of isolated incidents." He looked at me. "It is a sequence, a pause, and we are about to see what comes next." And with that he turned toward the stairs leading downward, into the deeper parts of the building, where, as I was beginning to understand with growing unease, the real purpose of Camden Passage House had not yet been revealed. The descent into the basement of Camden Passage House was unlike any I had previously experienced in London. It was not merely the physical lowering into darkness that unsettled me, but the sensation that each step carried us further away from the ordinary rules of investigation, and closer to something far more deliberate. The stairwell narrowed as we went down, the air thickened, and the sounds of the upper floors, the voices, the movement, the uneasy bustle of Scotland Yard officers gradually faded until we were left with only the echo of our own footsteps. Inspector Marlowe led the way with a lantern in hand. Holmes followed without haste. I brought up the rear, though I confess I found myself glancing repeatedly at the stone walls, half expecting them to shift or close behind us. Marlowe muttered under his breath, "If there is another body down here, Holmes, I warn you I will not tolerate theatrics." Holmes's reply was calm. "Then I suggest you prepare yourself for disappointment, Inspector." Marlowe looked back. "No body?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he said, "That depends on your definition of body." That cryptic remark was left to hang unanswered. That cryptic remark was left to hang unanswered as we reached the basement landing. The door at the bottom was already open, which in itself was curious. Marlowe stopped. "This was locked," he said sharply. A constable at the base of the stairs nodded. "Yes, sir." We forced it open. Holmes stepped past them and entered first. I followed. The basement was not what I had expected. It was not a storage space cluttered with forgotten objects or the damp, chaotic accumulation of urban neglect. Instead, it was orderly, almost clinical. Stone pillars supported a low ceiling, and along the walls ran a series of faint markings, chalk lines, measurements, annotations. Holmes stopped immediately upon seeing them. Marlowe raised his lantern. "What in God's name is this?" Holmes did not respond at once. He walked slowly along the nearest wall, studying the markings with increasing focus. Then he said quietly, "This is not a basement." Marlowe frowned. "What?" Holmes gestured. "This is a diagram." I stepped closer. At first I thought he was mistaken, but then I saw it. The markings were not random. They followed a structure. Lines intersected at calculated angles. Distances were measured with precision. Points were marked with numbers. "Watson," Holmes said, "what do you observe?" "It looks mapped," I replied. He turned slightly. "But mapped for what purpose?" Marlowe gave a short laugh. "Are you suggesting the basement is some sort of drawing?" Holmes nodded. "And more than that." He tapped the wall lightly. "It is a replication of the rooms above us." That statement drew my full attention. "What do you mean?" I asked. Holmes pointed upward. 2 locked rooms, identical in structure, slight variations in mechanism. He gestured around us. "And here beneath them a third layer. A pause. A control layer." Marlowe shook his head. "This is madness." Holmes looked at him. "Is it?" He walked to the center of the basement. "Consider the pattern." He raised his lantern slightly. 2 rooms, 2 deaths, both staged. A pause, and both designed to be discovered in sequence. I felt a cold understanding beginning to form. "You are saying the basement explains the arrangement," I said slowly. Holmes nodded. Marlowe frowned. "So what is it? Some kind of criminal workshop?" Holmes turned toward him. "No." He stepped closer. "It is a rehearsal space." Silence followed. Even Marlowe seemed momentarily unsettled. "A rehearsal for what?" he asked. Holmes's voice lowered. "For observation." A pause. "Someone is testing how we respond to constructed death scenes." I felt a chill run through me. "That is impossible," I said. Holmes turned toward me. "Is it?" He walked to one of the marked walls. "Look carefully, Watson." I did. At first I saw nothing beyond chalk lines. Then I noticed something subtle. Certain markings repeated, not randomly, but in intervals, like patterns in music. Holmes continued. The rooms above are not independent incidents. He tapped the wall. They are iterations. Marlowe narrowed his eyes. You are suggesting experimentation. Holmes nodded. With murder? Or its simulation, Holmes replied. A silence followed. Then Holmes added, and someone is studying our reactions to it. That statement changed the air in the room entirely. Even the lantern seemed dimmer. Marlowe exhaled sharply. This is preposterous. Holmes did not look at him. Is it? He walked toward a section of the wall where the chalk markings converged. This point here corresponds to the first room. He moved slightly, and this one to the second. A pause. And this central convergence... He stopped. This is where the observer stands. I frowned. The observer? Holmes turned to me. Someone watches from here? Holmes nodded slowly. And adjusts accordingly. Marlowe stepped forward. That is speculation. Holmes looked at him. No. He pointed to faint impressions on the floor. Footprints. We all looked down. They were subtle, barely visible, but unmistakably present. Repeated movement, circles of pacing, a fixed position near the center. Holmes spoke quietly. Someone has been down here frequently. A pause. And recently? Marlowe frowned. But who? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied the space. Then he said, the person controlling the rooms above. A silence followed. Then a constable from the stairs called down urgently. Marlowe turned. What is it now? The constable appeared pale. There's something you need to see upstairs. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. Yes, he said softly. It has begun. Marlowe looked frustrated. What has begun? Holmes turned toward the stairs. The correction. I frowned. Correction? Holmes nodded. When a pattern is observed, he said quietly, it is often adjusted. A pause. And when it is adjusted, he looked at me. The experiment becomes active. Marlowe shook his head. I am tired of your theories, Holmes. Holmes smiled faintly. I am not offering theories, Inspector. He began ascending the stairs. I am describing behavior. I followed immediately, because I had come to recognize that tone in Holmes's voice. It was not speculation. It was recognition. And as we climbed back toward the upper floors of Camden Passage House, I could not shake the feeling that whatever we had seen in the basement was not the source of the mystery, but only its instruction manual. We returned to the upper floors of Camden Passage House with a haste that had not been present in our descent. Something had changed. Not in the building itself, though. I could not have explained precisely why I felt that, but in the manner in which it now seemed to respond to us. It was as though our presence had been registered, not by the staff, not by Scotland Yard, but by the structure itself. Inspector Marlowe led us back through the corridor with quick, clipped steps. "What now?" he demanded. "Another basement? Another diagram? Another of Holmes's theatrical revelations?" Holmes did not answer. He was listening. That much I noticed immediately. Not to Marlowe, not to me, but to the building. We reached the landing where the second locked room had been discovered. The door still stood open. The body still lay within, but Holmes did not look at it. Instead, he turned his head slightly toward the far end of the corridor, where there had been no door before. Now there was one. I stopped. "That wasn't there earlier," I said. Marlowe frowned. "What are you talking about?" I pointed. "That door." The inspector turned sharply. His expression changed instantly. "It wasn't there," he muttered. Holmes stepped forward. "Yes," he said quietly. "It was." A pause. "And we simply were not permitted to see it." Marlowe's voice hardened. "This is nonsense. Doors do not appear." Holmes looked at him. "Not on their own." He walked toward it, and I followed. The door was unlike the others in the building. Newer, heavier, reinforced, and unlike the previous two rooms, this one bore no obvious keyhole, only a single brass handle. Holmes did not touch it immediately. Instead, he examined the frame, slowly, carefully. Then he said, "This is the third iteration." Marlowe frowned. "Iteration?" Holmes nodded. He gestured back toward the corridor. "First room, death staged in isolation." A pause. "Second room, replication of the first." He turned toward the new door. This, I felt uneasy. "What is different?" I asked. Holmes looked at me. "This one is not empty." A silence followed. Marlowe scoffed nervously. "How do you know?" Holmes raised a hand. "Listen." We did. At first I heard nothing. A sound, very faint, not movement, not struggle, breathing. Marlowe stepped back immediately. "There is someone inside." Holmes nodded. The inspector's voice sharpened. "Open it!" Holmes did not move. "Not yet." Marlowe rounded on him. Holmes did not move. "Not yet." Marlowe rounded on him. "Holmes, there is a living person inside a locked room." Holmes interrupted calmly. "I am aware." A pause. "But you are assuming it is a victim." That sentence froze the corridor. Marlowe blinked. "What else would it be?" Holmes stepped closer to the door. "That," he said quietly, "is what we are about to discover." He reached into his coat and produced a thin instrument, a pick, but he did not use it immediately. Instead, he leaned closer to the door and spoke softly. "Can you hear me?" Silence inside. A faint shift in the breathing. Holmes nodded. Marlowe stepped forward. "Whoever is inside, identify yourself." Holmes raised a hand. "Do not." The inspector frowned. "What do you mean, do not?" Holmes kept his eyes on the door. "Because it may not answer as a victim." A pause. "And that matters." I frowned. "Why?" Holmes turned slightly. "Because in constructed rooms," he said quietly, "identity is not always fixed." That statement made no sense to me at the time. Holmes knelt again at the lock, but instead of working it, he studied the door surface. Then he frowned. "There is no lock." Marlowe blinked. "What?" Holmes pointed. "No external locking mechanism." He looked up slowly. "This room was not designed to be opened." A silence followed. Then the breathing inside the room changed, slightly, as though reacting to our presence. Holmes stood, and for the first time in this investigation I saw something in his expression I had not yet witnessed. He stepped back. "Watson," he said quietly. "Yes?" "Stand away from the door." I obeyed immediately. Marlowe hesitated. "Holmes, what are you doing?" Holmes did not look at him. "Learning." He knocked once on the door. A single controlled knock. Inside the breathing stopped, entirely. A silence followed so absolute it felt unnatural. Marlowe whispered, "What did you do?" Holmes raised his hand. "Listen." We did. At first nothing. A voice. And unmistakably composed. "You are early." Marlowe froze. I felt my blood run cold. Holmes, however, did not move. He simply replied, "No." A pause. "We are precisely on time." A faint sound came from inside. Not movement, not fear, amusement. Then the voice spoke again. "Then you have reached the correct room." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. A pause. "And you are?" Silence inside. "I am the part of the pattern you have not yet understood." Marlowe stepped forward angrily. "Open this door immediately." Holmes did not stop him this time, but before the inspector could touch it, Holmes said softly, "If you open it, Inspector, you may destroy the only coherent witness we have." That stopped him. I turned sharply. "Witness?" Holmes nodded. He looked at the door. The first two rooms contained evidence. A pause. "This one contains awareness." Inside the voice spoke again. "Dr. Watson is present." I stiffened. Holmes did not react. "Yes," he said, "and you know me." A pause. "I know all observers." Marlowe looked unsettled. "What is this?" Holmes ignored him. "What are you?" he asked the door. A pause. Then the voice replied, "I am the one who arranged the first room." "And the second." Marlowe stepped back. "That is impossible." Holmes's expression darkened slightly. "No," he said quietly. "It is consistent." He turned toward me. "Watson, do you recall the basement?" "The observer point." Holmes looked at the door. "It is not a location." A pause. "It is a position." Inside the voice spoke again. "You are close now, Mr. Holmes." Holmes nodded slightly. A pause. "And what am I close to?" A faint sound of movement inside. "The face." Marlowe frowned. "The face?" Holmes's eyes narrowed further. "The face in the locked room," he repeated quietly. A pause, and for the first time the voice changed slightly, as if smiling. Silence fell across the corridor, and in that moment I understood something I cannot fully articulate even now. The locked rooms were not separate incidents. They were not even stages. They were questions. And we had just spoken to the one who had been asking them. Holmes stepped forward slightly. "What is your purpose?" The voice inside replied calmly. "To see who opens what should not be opened." A pause. "And you always do." Holmes stood very still, and then quietly. A silence followed. Then Holmes turned slightly to Marlowe. "Open it." The inspector hesitated. "You just said—" Holmes interrupted. "Open it." Marlowe swallowed, and placed his hand on the handle. Inside the breathing resumed, faster now. Not fear. and as the door began to turn, Holmes said quietly, almost himself, "So this is where you were hiding." The lock clicked, and the third room began to open. The door of the third room opened slowly, not with resistance, nor with any mechanical difficulty, but with the quiet inevitability of something that had been waiting far too long to be disturbed. Inspector Marlowe pushed it inward. A soft creak followed. Then silence. For a moment none of us moved. The corridor behind us seemed suddenly distant, as though Camden Passage House itself had withdrawn to watch what would occur. Inside the room the light was dimmer than in the others, not because there was less illumination, but because the space itself seemed to absorb it. Holmes stepped forward first. I followed. Marlowe hesitated only a moment before entering behind us, though I noticed his hand remained close to his revolver. The room was unlike the previous two. It was not staged as a living space, nor as a sealed chamber. It resembled something closer to an observation booth. Bare walls, a single chair positioned deliberately at the center, and facing it, a wall that had been fitted with a large rectangular mirror, not cracked, not aged, perfectly maintained. Marlowe frowned. "What is this supposed to be?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He walked slowly toward the mirror, and stopped. For a long moment he said nothing. I saw his expression tighten ever so slightly. Not surprise, but confirmation. "Watson," he said quietly. "Yes? Tell me what you see." I stepped forward and looked into the mirror. At first I saw only our reflections, Holmes standing still, myself beside him, Marlowe slightly behind. But something was wrong. The reflection did not match our positioning exactly. It was a fraction of a second behind reality. I stepped back instinctively. "This mirror," I said, "it's—" "Wrong," Holmes finished calmly. Marlowe stepped closer. "It's just glass." Holmes shook his head. "No." He approached the mirror directly, and then he knocked on it. A hollow sound, not reflective glass, but something layered. Marlowe frowned. "What is this?" Holmes turned slightly. "Not a mirror. A pause. A recording surface." That word made no sense to me in the context of our world. Holmes continued quietly. "Or more precisely, a controlled perception device." Marlowe scoffed. "This is absurd." Holmes ignored him. He examined the chair, then the floor beneath it, then the edges of the room. Finally he spoke. "This is where the observer sits." Silence followed. Marlowe laughed nervously. "The observer? There's no one here." Holmes did not look at him. There was a pause. "And recently." I frowned. "How can you tell?" Holmes pointed to the chair. "Indentation." He walked closer. "Worn fabric." He bent slightly. "And warmth that has not yet fully dissipated." Marlowe stepped forward. "You are suggesting someone was here minutes ago?" Holmes nodded. A silence followed. Then Holmes turned toward the mirror again and spoke softly. "You may come out now." Nothing happened. Marlowe exhaled sharply. "This is ridiculous." Holmes raised a hand. "Patience." A pause. A sound, not from inside the room, but from behind the mirror. A soft shift, like fabric moving. Marlowe immediately drew his revolver. "Stay where you are." Holmes did not move. The mirror remained unchanged. Then, slowly, a section of it darkened, as though something behind it was moving closer. And then a face appeared, not reflected, not distorted, but present behind the surface. A man, composed, watching us. Marlowe stepped back instinctively. "What the—" Holmes spoke quietly. At last, the man behind the glass tilted his head slightly. "You are earlier than expected," he said calmly. Holmes nodded. "And yet still late." A faint smile appeared on the man's face. "Time behaves differently here." Holmes studied him carefully. "Who are you?" The man considered this, a difficult question. He glanced slightly toward the chair. "I have used several names." Holmes nodded. A pause. "But none of them are yours." The man smiled faintly. "Names are temporary interfaces." Marlowe looked increasingly alarmed. "Holmes, what is this?" Holmes raised a hand. The inspector hesitated. Holmes turned back to the man. "You arranged the first room." "And this?" The man nodded. Holmes studied him. "Why?" A pause. The man looked almost curious. "To see how you interpret absence." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And what did you conclude?" The man smiled slightly. "That you assume absence implies death." A pause. "And control." Holmes did not respond immediately. Then he said quietly, "And the locked room?" The man gestured faintly. "A question." About what? The man's gaze sharpened slightly. Whether observation changes outcome. A silence followed. Marlowe stepped forward angrily. This is nonsense. You're under arrest. The man did not react. Holmes, however, raised a hand without looking back. Inspector. Marlowe stopped. Holmes's voice remained calm. This is not a conventional suspect. The man behind the glass smiled faintly. No. He nodded. I am not inside your jurisdiction. Holmes studied him carefully. And yet you are present in 3 crime scenes. The man nodded again. A pause. And absent from all of them. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. Except this one. The man tilted his head. Silence followed. Then Holmes said quietly, You are the face. The man smiled. At last. Holmes continued. The face in the locked room. The man nodded. Marlowe whispered, That makes no sense. Holmes did not look at him. It makes perfect sense, he said softly, if you stop assuming the face belongs to a body. A pause, and instead belongs to the system arranging the rooms. The man behind the glass leaned slightly forward. You are close, Mr. Holmes. Holmes nodded once. And what is the system? The man smiled. You are standing inside it. A silence followed so complete it felt almost physical. Then Holmes said, Then show yourself fully. The man paused. For the first time his expression shifted slightly. Not fear, not hesitation, but consideration. Then he said, You already have. Holmes frowned slightly. No. The man gestured gently. You have seen every part of me. A pause, just not assembled at once. Marlowe looked between them. This is madness. Holmes ignored him. He stepped closer to the mirror. And if I break this surface? The man smiled faintly. Then you lose the observer. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And the experiment? The man tilted his head. Continues? Holmes stood still for a long moment. Then he said quietly, So this is not a case. The man nodded. No. Holmes continued. It is a study. Yes. A pause. Of us. The man smiled slightly. Of how you solve what has no single origin. Holmes stepped back slowly, and for the first time since we had entered Camden Passage House, he said nothing, and in that silence I understood something deeply unsettling. We had not been chasing a murderer. We had been answering questions posed to us by something that did not think like a man. It observed like one, but it constructed like something else entirely. Holmes finally spoke. Watson. Yes? This is no longer about a locked room. A pause. It never was. And as I looked once more into the face behind the glass, I realized the truth was no longer hidden. It was simply unfinished. The silence that followed Holmes's last words was unlike any I had ever experienced in an investigation. It was not merely the absence of sound. It was the absence of direction. As though the very structure of meaning within Camden Passage House had loosened its hold upon reality and left us suspended in something undefined. The man behind the glass remained still, watching, waiting. Holmes, however, had changed, not outwardly. He still stood with his familiar composure, hands loosely folded, gaze fixed upon the mirror. But something in his stillness had sharpened. Like a blade that has finally found the correct angle against stone. Inspector Marlowe broke first. This is insane, he muttered. We are speaking to a face behind glass as though it is a suspect. Holmes did not look at him. Inspector, he said calmly, you are speaking to a structure, not a person. Calmly, you are speaking to a structure, not a person. Marlowe frowned. A structure? Holmes nodded slightly. Yeah. He stepped closer to the mirror. And structures can be dismantled. The man behind the glass smiled faintly. You would attempt that? Holmes's voice remained steady. I have done so before. A pause. The man tilted his head. Not with something like me. Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied the room again, slowly, methodically. For the first time since entering the third room, I noticed Holmes was no longer reacting to the face. He was reacting to the space, the walls, the proportions, the alignment of objects, as though recalculating something that had previously been accepted. Then he spoke quietly. This room is not independent. The man behind the glass nodded. No. Holmes continued. It is dependent. Holmes turned slightly. On what? A pause. Then the man said, On continuity. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The man gestured faintly. You have seen 3 rooms. Holmes nodded. And believe them sequential. The man smiled slightly. They are not. A silence followed. Holmes's expression changed almost imperceptibly. For the first time I saw uncertainty not in conclusion but in structure. He turned slowly toward Marlowe. Spector. Yes? How many rooms have we seen? 3, Marlowe replied immediately. Holmes shook his head. No. He turned back to the mirror. We have seen fragments. The man behind the glass inclined his head. Holmes stepped forward again. Then show me the whole. A pause. The man smiled faintly. You already stand within it. Holmes did not blink. Then explained the inconsistency. The man tilted his head. Which inconsistency? Holmes's voice sharpened slightly. The time-stamps. A silence followed. Even Marlowe frowned. Holmes continued. Henry Ellison died at 3:17. A pause. Robert Henslow also linked to 3.17. He stepped closer. But the observations were made hours apart. The man behind the glass studied him. Holmes's eyes narrowed. That violates linear sequence. The man nodded. Holmes paused. And yet the rooms appear sequential. Yes. Holmes's expression tightened. Then the sequence is false. The man smiled. Now you are beginning to see. A silence followed. Holmes turned slowly. Watson. Yes? Do you recall the basement markings? The repetition? Holmes nodded. That is not repetition. A pause. It is layering. The man behind the glass spoke softly. Very good. Holmes turned sharply back. You are not constructing rooms. The man nodded. No. Holmes continued. You are constructing perception. A pause. Holmes's voice lowered. Of us. The man smiled. Of understanding. Marlowe stepped forward suddenly. This is nonsense. We are dealing with murders. Holmes turned to him. Are we? The inspector hesitated. Holmes continued calmly. No wounds. No struggle. No entry. He paused. Only arrangement. A silence followed. Then Holmes said quietly, And arrangement is not always violent. The man behind the glass leaned forward slightly. Holmes studied him. Then what is the purpose of Camden Passage House? The man's expression softened slightly. To test interpretation. Holmes frowned. Interpretation of what? The man gestured lightly. Holmes stood very still. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Holmes said, You are not a murderer. The man smiled faintly. No. Holmes continued, And yet there are dead men. A pause. Holmes stepped closer. Then explained the contradiction. The man's voice remained calm. There is no contradiction. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The man raised one hand slightly. You assume death is an endpoint. Holmes did not respond. The man continued. It is sometimes an input. A silence followed. Marlowe whispered. What does that mean? Holmes did not answer him. Instead he stepped back slowly, and for the first time I saw something in his expression I had never seen before. Not confusion, not doubt, but recalibration. He was not solving the case any more. He was redefining it. Holmes spoke quietly. Watson. Yes? We are not inside a building. A pause. We are inside a construct. Marlowe shook his head. That is absurd. Holmes ignored him. He turned toward the mirror again. And the face? The man behind the glass smiled. Yes? Holmes's voice was low. Is not a person. A pause. It is a function. The man nodded. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. Then what function are you performing? The man looked at him for a long moment, then said, Completion. A silence followed. Holmes exhaled slowly, and said something that altered the entire trajectory of the investigation. Then this case is not about who died. A pause. It is about what remains unfinished. The man behind the glass smiled faintly. Now you understand why there are 3 rooms. Holmes nodded slowly. And not 4. The man tilted his head. Not yet. A silence followed. Then Holmes turned away from the mirror and looked at Marlowe. Leave the room. The inspector frowned. What? Holmes repeated calmly. Leave. Marlowe hesitated. You are abandoning the investigation? Holmes shook his head. No. A pause. I am isolating it. That statement made no sense to Marlowe, but it made perfect sense to me. Because I suddenly realized Holmes was no longer trying to catch someone. He was trying to stop the system from continuing. Marlowe stepped backward slowly. This is madness. Holmes did not look at him. Possibly. A pause. But it is structured madness. And as Marlowe finally retreated into the corridor, Holmes turned once more to the mirror and said quietly, "Now we begin dismantling it." Inside the glass, the man smiled for the last time. "Good," he said. "Then we proceed to the final layer." And for the first time, the mirror did not reflect us at all. The moment the mirror ceased to reflect us, the room changed in a way that was not immediately visible, yet impossible to ignore. It was as though Camden Passage House had shifted its attention fully inward. The walls no longer felt like boundaries, they felt like definitions. Holmes remained still, standing directly before the glass surface that no longer returned our image. For a long time he did not speak, neither did the man behind it. Then Holmes said quietly, "So it is complete." The voice from within replied at once, "No." A pause. "Not yet." Inspector Marlowe, who had returned cautiously to the threshold of the room, looked visibly unsettled. "I do not like this," he muttered. "Not at all." Holmes did not turn to him. "Then do not participate." Marlowe frowned. "I am a Scotland Yard inspector. I am required to—" Holmes interrupted gently. "You are not required for this stage." That sentence alone silenced him. Holmes stepped closer to the mirror. Now it showed nothing, not even darkness, just depth, a flat, impossible absence. Holmes spoke again. "Then show me the origin point." A pause. The man's voice came softly. "You are standing near it." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Near is not sufficient." The voice responded. "It is rarely exact." Holmes turned slightly. "Watson." "Yes? Do you recall the basement diagram?" "The convergence point." Holmes nodded slowly. "We were correct to identify it as an observer position." A pause. "But incorrect about its function." I frowned. "In what way?" Holmes turned toward me. "It is not a place from which observation occurs." A pause. "It is a place from which reality is adjusted." That sentence unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Holmes continued quietly. "Every room we have seen was not a separate crime scene." He gestured toward the mirror. "They were corrections." Marlowe shook his head. "This is nonsense." Holmes ignored him. He spoke to the mirror again. "You are not an individual." A pause. The voice replied. "No." Holmes continued. "You are distributed." Holmes nodded slowly. "Across locations. Across rooms." A silence followed. Then Holmes said quietly, "And across perception." The voice did not immediately respond. When it did, there was a subtle change, not in tone, but in weight. Holmes exhaled slowly, then said, "Watson." "Yes?" "I want you to recall every detail you considered inconsistent." I hesitated. "The watches," I said. "The timing discrepancies." I hesitated. "The watches," I said. "The timing discrepancies." "The duplicate rooms." Holmes nodded. "All of them are symptoms of a single principle." A pause. "Nonlinearity of observation." Marlowe stepped forward. "I refuse to accept that as explanation." Holmes finally looked at him. "Then accept this instead." A pause. "Nothing we have seen is independent of being seen." Silence followed. The man behind the mirror spoke again. "You are approaching convergence." Holmes nodded. "Yeah." "And what lies at convergence?" A pause. The voice replied. Holmes stepped back slightly. "And what is being resolved?" The voice answered simply. A silence followed. Then Holmes said quietly, "Then this is not a murder investigation at all." A pause. "It is a calibration test." The voice responded. Holmes turned slowly toward me, and for the first time in this entire investigation I saw something in his expression that was deeply unsettling. Not fear, not confusion, but implication. "Watson," he said quietly. "Yes?" "Have you noticed something missing from every scene?" I thought for a moment. "The motive?" Holmes shook his head. "No." "The perpetrator?" "No." He paused. "Yourself." I froze. "What do you mean?" Holmes stepped closer. "In every room," he said quietly. "You were present as observer." A pause. "But never as participant," Marlowe scoffed. "That is obvious. Watson is your assistant." Holmes did not look at him. "That is not what I mean." He turned toward the mirror again. The voice spoke softly. "He is partially correct." Holmes narrowed his eyes. The voice continued. "Observation is distributed." A pause. "Not assigned." Holmes went very still. I felt a strange discomfort I could not fully define. "What is that supposed to mean?" I asked. Holmes raised a hand slightly. "Wait." He turned to the mirror. "You are suggesting Watson is part of the system." A pause. The voice replied, "He is within it." Marlowe looked sharply at me. "Why?" Holmes did not react. He simply studied the mirror, then said quietly, "Define vitin." The voice replied, "Present during calibration events." Holmes turned slowly toward me, and for the first time I felt something I had never felt in his presence before. Not suspicion, but re-evaluation. Holmes spoke softly. "Watson!" "Yes?" "Do you recall the moment you first saw the photograph?" I hesitated. "Yes." Holmes nodded. "And your reaction was immediate recognition of unfamiliarity." He stepped closer. "And yet you accepted its validity without question." I frowned. "What are you suggesting?" Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he said, "Tell me, what did you feel in the first locked room?" I hesitated. "Confusion." "And in the second?" "Unease." "And in the basement?" "Disorientation." Holmes nodded slowly. "And now?" I hesitated. Holmes exhaled slowly, then turned back to the mirror. "And there it is." A pause. The voice spoke softly. "Convergence confirmed." Holmes closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "So I am not solving this alone." A pause. The voice answered, "No." Holmes turned slightly toward me, and said something I will never forget. "Watson, we are not outside this system." A pause. "We are describing it from within." Marlowe shook his head violently. "This is madness." Holmes ignored him completely. Instead, he stepped forward. "And the face?" the voice replied. "It is not singular." Holmes nodded slowly. "Of course it isn't." A pause. "It never was." The mirror surface began to shift again, not breaking, not changing, but deepening, as though layers were folding into one another. Holmes stepped back slowly, and said quietly, "Then we have reached the final layer." The voice replied. A silence followed. Then Holmes said, "What's—" "Yes? I believe we are about to understand what this room truly is." The mirror darkened completely, and for the first time it began to show us something we had not seen before. Ourselves, but not as we were. As something being observed, from somewhere else entirely. The image within the mirror did not behave as any reflection ought to behave. It did not imitate us. It evaluated us. Holmes stood motionless before it, his gaze fixed upon the shifting surface as though he were reading not glass, but a conclusion being formed in real time. Inspector Marlowe had retreated almost to the doorway, his earlier confidence entirely eroded. "I have had enough of this," he muttered. "Enough of mirrors that think and voices that speak like philosophers." No one answered him, because by then it was no longer clear whether the voice belonged to the mirror, the room, or something beyond both. The image inside the glass sharpened. It showed us standing in the same room, but not precisely as we were. Our positions were subtly different, Holmes slightly closer to the mirror than he actually stood. Myself turned at an angle I had not yet assumed, Marlowe absent entirely. I felt a cold tightening in my chest. "Holmes," I said quietly, "this is wrong." "Yes," he replied, "but not in the way you think." He did not take his eyes from the mirror. Inside it, Holmes turned his head and looked directly at us. A perfect synchronization, yet delayed, or advance. I could not determine which. The voice spoke again. "Measured. You are approaching stability." Holmes responded immediately. "Define stability." A pause. The mirror image of Holmes smiled faintly before the voice answered. Alignment between observation and outcome. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "So you admit there is a difference?" A silence followed. Then Holmes stepped forward. "What are you?" The mirror did not followed. Then Holmes stepped forward. "What are you?" The mirror did not answer immediately. Instead, the image inside it changed again. The room behind our reflections dissolved, reformed, and suddenly we were no longer looking at ourselves inside Camden Passage House. We were looking at multiple rooms, layered, overlapping, the two locked rooms, the basement, the third chamber, all visible at once. Marlowe gave a sharp, involuntary sound. "What is that supposed to be?" Holmes did not look at him. "It is not a place," he said quietly. "It is a model." The voice responded softly. Holmes nodded once. "So Camden Passage House is not a building." A pause. "It is a system," the voice replied. Holmes stepped closer. "And we are within it." A silence followed. Then Holmes said something that altered the entire direction of the conversation. "Then what is outside it?" A pause. For the first time the response was not immediate. The mirror flickered. The layered rooms shifted. Then the voice replied. Unresolved observation. Holmes frowned slightly. The voice continued. You assume exteriority. A pause. There is none. Holmes stood still. Behind him I felt Marlowe move uneasily. The voice continued. All observation exists within iteration. Holmes exhaled slowly. So there is no outside investigator. A pause. No. Holmes nodded slightly. Then what am I? The voice responded. A stabilizing variable. I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with reason. Holmes did not move. A variable, he repeated softly. Marlowe suddenly stepped forward. This is ridiculous. Holmes is the greatest detective in England. The voice responded calmly. Designation irrelevant. Marlowe froze. Holmes raised a hand slightly. Inspector, but Marlowe was already too agitated. You are talking to an illusion. Holmes did not turn. Possibly. The voice spoke again. Correction. A pause. Not illusion. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Then what? The mirror image shifted again, and for the first time the reflection did something deeply unsettling. It stopped mirroring us entirely. Instead, it showed us standing in an empty version of the room, without Marlowe, without even the door, just Holmes and myself. But the angle was wrong, as though we were being observed from above, from outside, from somewhere that should not have had perspective at all. Holmes spoke slowly. Watson. Yes, I believe we are not the first iteration of this case. A pause. We are one of many. The voice responded softly. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And what happens to previous iterations? The mirror flickered. Then the voice replied. Concluded. A silence followed. Holmes stood very still. Then he said quietly, And what defines conclusion? The voice answered. Recognition of pattern completion. Holmes nodded slowly. And failure? A pause. The mirror darkened slightly. Repetition. A silence followed. Then Holmes stepped back, and for the first time since entering Camden Passage House, I saw something in his expression I had never seen before. Not fear, not doubt, but burden. He turned slightly toward me. Watson. Yes? I think we have been here before. I frowned. What do you mean? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the mirror again. Inside it I saw something that made my breath catch. Not just us, but faint traces. Earlier versions of the same room. Earlier Holmeses. Earlier Watsons. Fractured. Layered. Incomplete. Holmes spoke quietly. This is not the first locked room. A pause. It is the latest attempt to define it. The voice responded softly. Holmes stepped forward again. And the face? The mirror shifted. And for a brief moment, we saw it. Not behind glass, not behind structure, but within it, everywhere at once, a presence distributed across every reflective surface, every arrangement of observation, every reconstructed room. The voice spoke softly. The face is continuity. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, so there is no killer. A pause. No individual. Holmes nodded slowly. Only structure. A silence followed. Then Holmes said quietly, Then this case cannot be solved. A pause. The voice replied, It can only be completed. Holmes exhaled slowly, and for the first time he stepped back from the mirror, not in retreat, but in acceptance. Marlowe looked between us, confused and shaken. What does that mean? He demanded. Holmes did not answer him. Instead, he said softly, It means we are no longer investigating Camden Passage House. A pause. We are inside its conclusion phase. The mirror darkened completely, and in the darkness that followed, something inside the room began to change, as though the system, having finally been understood, was now preparing to decide what to do with those who understood it. Chapter 11. The Breaking of Holmes. The darkness inside the mirror did not remain still. It breathed, not in any literal sense, of course, but in the way a system breathes when it recalibrates itself around an unexpected truth. Holmes stood very still, his gaze fixed upon the now opaque surface where the layered rooms had once been visible. Behind me, Inspector Marlowe had gone silent. That silence was far more alarming than his earlier protest. It suggested not disbelief, but surrender of comprehension. Then the voice returned, but it was no longer calm. It was, You have reached misalignment. Holmes did not move. Yes, he said quietly. A pause. The mirror flickered faintly, as though attempting to stabilize its own presence. Correction required. Holmes narrowed his eyes slightly. And what form does correction take? A pause. Restoration of singular interpretation. Marlowe whispered behind us. What does that mean? Holmes finally answered him without looking back. It means, he said quietly, that the system is attempting to simplify us. A silence followed. Then the room shifted, not physically, not visibly, but perceptually. The edges of the room seemed less certain, the air heavier, the light inconsistent. I felt with growing unease that Camden Passage House was no longer behaving as a static environment. It was responding. The mirror surface fractured into thin lines, like cracks forming in ice. Then the voice spoke again, but it was no longer singular. It overlapped, multiple tones slightly out of phase. Correction initiated. Holmes stepped back a fraction. For the first time since I had known him, I saw a tension in his posture that was not intellectual. It was structural, as though something inside the rules he understood was no longer obeying him. Marlowe suddenly shouted, I am not staying in this room another minute. He turned toward the door, but the door was no longer there. Where it had been there was now only wall, solid, seamless. Marlowe froze. That? Holmes nodded slowly. A pause, and now it is consistent. The inspector turned sharply. What does that mean? Holmes replied calmly. It means the system has removed exits that contradict its conclusion. The mirror flickered again, and this time it showed only Holmes, not me, not Marlowe, just Holmes, standing alone in the room. Holmes studied it carefully, then said softly, So it is attempting isolation. A pause. Holmes nodded once. To force resolution through a single variable. The voice responded. A silence followed. Then Holmes spoke quietly. You are trying to reduce me. The mirror answered. Holmes stepped forward slightly. And if I refuse? A pause. The system hesitated. Refusal is not a defined outcome. Holmes's eyes narrowed. That is incorrect. He stepped closer. It is the only meaningful outcome. Behind me, Marlowe whispered. Holmes, what are you doing? Holmes did not answer him. Instead, he said, Watts? Yes, if I am correct, the system cannot proceed if I cease to participate. I frowned. What do you mean? Holmes finally turned to me. For it to function, he said quietly, it requires observation. A pause. And interpretation. He turned back to the mirror. And I am the primary interpreter. The voice responded. Holmes nodded. So if I refuse interpretation... A pause. You lose coherence. The mirror flickered violently. Incorrect. Holmes did not flinch. Then prove it. A silence followed. The room trembled not physically but conceptually. The walls seemed to struggle to remain defined. Marlowe stumbled slightly. What is happening? He shouted. Holmes raised a hand slightly. Stay still. The mirror surface cracked further. The voice now came in fragmented bursts. Stability required. Observation incomplete. Variable non responsive. Holmes watched calmly. Then he said quietly, This is it. A pause. The breaking point. I stepped forward. Holmes, what is happening to the room? He replied without turning. It is attempting to decide what we are. A pause. And failing. The mirror suddenly went blank, completely. No reflection, no image, no depth, just absence. And in that absence, the voice spoke one final time. Not as a system, not as a structure, but almost uncertain. Define self. Holmes went still. For a long moment he did not respond. Then he said quietly, I am not a function of observation. A pause. I am the refusal to accept incomplete data. The room shuddered. The mirror refusal to accept incomplete data. The room shuddered. The mirror darkened further. Here, Holmes stepped forward. You cannot resolve what does not comply. A pause. I do not comply. The silence that followed was absolute. Something changed. Not the room, not the mirror, but the sense of presence within it, as though something that had been holding everything together had finally loosened its grip. Marlowe dropped to one knee. What is happening to the room? Holmes turned slightly. It is collapsing its assumptions. A pause. And with them. He looked at the mirror. Its authority. The mirror fractured, not physically, but conceptually. The image of Holmes inside it multiplied, then blurred, then separated, and finally ceased to align with anything in the room at all. The voice spoke once more, but weakly. Observation? Holmes nodded. A pause. And now you end. A long silence followed. Nothing. The mirror went completely inert. The walls stabilized. The door reappeared. Marlowe gasped. It's over?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He simply stood there for a long moment, studying the now ordinary surface before us. Then he said quietly, "No." A pause. "It has just stopped speaking." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Holmes turned toward the door. "It means," he said softly, "we are no longer being observed." A pause. "And that is never the same as being free." And with that, he opened the door. The corridor outside the third room felt impossibly ordinary. Gas lamps still burned with their familiar yellow glow. Footsteps echoed faintly from the floors above. Somewhere in the distance a door closed with the careless finality of everyday life continuing unaware of what had just unraveled beneath it. And yet, for those of us who had stood inside that final chamber, nothing about the world felt restored, only suspended. Inspector Marlowe stepped out first, as though escaping drowning water. He gripped the wall for balance, his face pale and drawn. I don't understand," he said hoarsely. "It was there. We saw it, and now it's just gone." Holmes followed without urgency. He did not look relieved. He looked as though the problem had not ended but merely changed its disguise. I stepped into the corridor behind him and immediately felt the absence, not of danger, but of attention. "It is a strange sensation," Dr. Watson noted in retrospect, "to realize one has ceased to be noticed by something that previously defined the terms of one's reality." Holmes turned slowly, glancing back toward the third room. The door stood open. Inside only a normal empty chamber. No mirror, no chair in the center, no impossible architecture, just stone, dust, and silence. Marlowe exhaled sharply. "It was all illusion," he said quickly. "Mass hysteria, suggestion, gaslight, reflection, something explainable." Holmes did not correct him. That alone unsettled me, because Holmes always corrected false simplicity. Instead, he said quietly, "No." Marlowe blinked. "No?" Holmes stepped closer to the doorway. "It was real," he said. A pause, just not persistent. I frowned. "What does that mean?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied the empty room as though expecting it to resume speaking. Then he said, "It means the structure has ceased active configuration." Marlowe gave a short, nervous laugh. "That is just another way of saying it stopped existing." Holmes turned slightly toward him. "No," he said calmly. "It means it stopped needing us." Silence followed. That sentence was more disturbing than anything we had encountered inside the room, because it implied something we had not yet considered, that our role had been conditional. Holmes walked slowly down the corridor. I followed. Marlowe hesitated, then joined us reluctantly. As we descended the stairs, the building felt different, not abandoned, not changed physically. But Holmes spoke softly as we walked. "Watson." "Yes? Do you remember the face?" I hesitated. Holmes nodded. "And how would you describe it now?" "It was not one person," I said slowly. "It was inconsistent, as if it belonged everywhere, nowhere." Holmes nodded again. "Exactly." A pause. "And now?" I frowned. "I am not sure I could describe it at all." Holmes stopped briefly on the stairs. "That," he said quietly, "is important." Marlowe frowned. "What is?" Holmes continued walking. "The absence of recall." A pause. "If something cannot be consistently remembered, it is not anchored." I glanced at him. "Anchored to what?" Holmes replied softly. We reached the ground floor. The front door of Camden Passage House stood open, letting in cold evening air. Outside, London continued as though nothing had changed. Carriages passed. Voices called. Life proceeded in its indifferent rhythm. Marlowe stepped out first, almost stumbling into the street. "I need to report this," he muttered. "Whatever this was, I need official documentation." Holmes remained just inside the doorway. He did not step out immediately. Instead, he looked back into the building. For a long time he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. "It has adapted." I frowned. "What has?" Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he said. Marlowe turned sharply. "You said it ended." Holmes finally stepped into the street. "No," he corrected. "It changed state." A pause. "And that is more dangerous." I felt a slight unease. "Why?" Holmes looked up at the building facade. "Because unresolved systems do not disappear," he said quietly. "They relocate." Marlowe shook his head. "This is nonsense. There is no system. There was a criminal, if there even was one, and now it is over." Holmes turned toward him. "Is it?" A pause. Marlowe hesitated. Holmes continued calmly. "Tell me, Inspector, what was the motive?" Marlowe opened his mouth, then closed it. Holmes nodded slightly. "Exactly." A silence followed. Then Holmes added, "We assumed there was one." He turned back toward the building, "But we never confirmed it." A pause. "And yet events still occurred in structured sequence." I frowned. "So what are you saying now?" Holmes spoke quietly. "I am saying we have not eliminated the presence." A pause. "We have only removed its expression." Marlowe looked uneasy again. "So it could return?" Holmes did not answer immediately. "It never left." A silence followed. The street around us remained ordinary, but something in Holmes's posture had changed. Not alarm, not fear, but awareness, as though he had accepted that some investigations do not conclude in truth, only in temporary silence. Finally he spoke. "Watson." "Yes? If you are asked about this case again—" He paused. "You will not describe it as a sequence of murders." I frowned. "What then?" Holmes looked at me steadily. "As a system that briefly permitted itself to be understood." A pause, and then adjusted. The wind passed between the buildings. For a moment I thought I saw... The wind passed between the buildings. For a moment I thought I saw movement in the upper windows of Camden Passage House. But when I looked again there was nothing. Holmes turned away. "Come," he said quietly. "We are finished here." But as we walked down the street together I could not shake the feeling. That something had not ended at all, only changed its method of observation. I had thought in my innocence that silence would follow Camden Passage House. But silence, I have learned, is rarely an ending. More often it is a pause in which something reconsiders its form. 3 nights after our departure from the house, I sat alone in my room at Baker Street attempting to commit the events to paper in proper chronological order. Holmes had instructed me to do so. "Write it precisely as it occurred," he had said, almost absently, as though the matter no longer held urgency for him. Yet every time I attempted to fix the sequence something subtle resisted. Names felt uncertain, timelines blurred. Even the memory of the third room seemed reluctant to remain still upon the page. It was late when I noticed the first inconsistency. My notebook already contained several pages describing the locked rooms, the mirrors, the voice, and the basement structure. And yet, I distinctly remembered writing something different earlier. A detail about the photograph. A remark Holmes had made about faces that should not exist. But when I turned back, the line was gone. Not crossed out. Not erased. I felt a faint unease. At that moment Holmes entered without knocking. He did not greet me. Instead, he walked directly to my desk and looked down at my notes. For a long time he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. "You have noticed it." I looked up. "Holmes, the notes are changing." He nodded once. A pause. "As expected." "What do you mean, expected?" Holmes turned slightly toward the window. "Do you recall what the system called itself?" I hesitated. "The Observer?" He shook his head. "Not the name, the function." I thought back. "Continuity." Holmes nodded. "Yeah." A pause. "And what does continuity require?" I frowned. "Consistency." Holmes turned to me. "And what threatens consistency?" I hesitated. "Contradiction." He nodded again. "More precisely," he said quietly, "interpretation." A silence followed. I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Holmes, what are you saying?" He finally looked at me directly. "I am saying the system did not end." A pause. "It adapted to the only part of itself it could not remove." I frowned. "And that is?" Holmes stepped closer. I froze. "Myself?" Holmes nodded. "Not as a person." A pause. "As a recorder." The room felt suddenly smaller. "That is absurd," I said. "Is it?" Holmes replied calmly. He gestured toward my notebook. "Your account is the only structured continuity the case possesses." I looked down instinctively. The ink on the page seemed unstable, not fading, but shifting slightly when not directly observed. I felt my pulse quicken. "What are you suggesting?" I asked quietly. Holmes spoke with careful precision. "The system could not persist as a physical structure." A pause. "It could not persist as a voice." He looked at me. "But it could persist as narrative coherence." I shook my head. "That makes no sense." Holmes nodded slightly. "To you, no." A pause. "To it, yes." I felt a chill move through me. "You're saying the case is alive in my writing?" Holmes corrected gently. "Not alive." A pause. "Maintained." I stared at him. "That is impossible." Holmes walked to my desk and closed the notebook softly. "Then explain," he said quietly, "why the details change only when unobserved." I said nothing, because I had no answer. Holmes continued, "Watson, do you remember the face?" I hesitated. "Describe it." I tried, and found to my discomfort that I could not fix it. It shifted in memory, not dramatically, but enough to prevent certainty. Holmes watched me carefully. "And now," he said quietly, "you understand the final layer." I frowned. "What final layer?" Holmes turned toward the window. "The observer was never inside Camden Passage House." A pause. It was the structure that decided what would be remembered. He looked back at me, and it is still deciding. A long silence followed. Then I asked almost reluctantly, "Then what was the locked room?" Holmes paused. For once he did not answer immediately. Then he said quietly, "A question that only exists as long as it is being answered." A pause. "And we answered it?" I felt my throat tighten. "Then it is over." Holmes shook his head. "No." He stepped toward the door. "It is only stable for now." I looked at him. "Holmes, where does it go from here?" He opened the door slightly, and then said something I will never forget. "Wherever it is written next." A pause. "And Watson—" He looked back at me. "Be careful how you end it." Then he left. I sat alone for a long time after that, and when I returned to my notebook I noticed something that made my hand go still upon the page. A final line I did not remember writing. Fresh ink, as if just completed. It read, "The face is still observing the story." I closed the notebook, and I have not written the case again since. Dr. John H. Watson.